Welcome everyone to this chess video. Today we'll be analyzing a game from a viewer of mine and also a longtime chess.com friend. Now this game they sent in is really instructional and they actually annotated the game, so we have a few extra insights that we can add to help them learn to see similar mindset flaws that you may have in your own games. If you want to send in any of your own games to have analyzed, the forum link on chess.com is posted in the video description. But let's not waste too much time because this is a really interesting game. E4, C5, of course the Sicilian Defense. Knight f3, d6, and then d4, the open variation, extremely popular. And at this moment, they mentioned in their annotations that this was from a correspondence game, preferred to play a main line such as this rather than a sideline. I don't want to get into the nuances of correspondence chess. If people are interested in my tips for correspondence chess, I may create a future YouTube video on it. This being a correspondence game also means there's a lot more time for both sides to think, and so this is probably going to be a higher quality game. We have c captures d4, knight captures back, knight f6, and then knight c3. A long time ago I made a YouTube video on this exact position and why you want to be playing knight f6 for black and provoke white into playing knight c3. So if this opening theory concept is new to you, you can check out that video, which I'll link as well. But now we have e6 played, the French defense variation of the Sicilian. And just like the French defense, we're going to be preparing pawn d5. If I go to the very beginning of the game, you'll see the very similar pattern, where here we have the French defense. And so you can see how a move order nuance might reach that same position. We return back to our game, and you'll see we're just one move away from playing that, with a few pieces developed. But now here's where things get really interesting. For people who play the Sicilian and know opening theory, you will know that bishop to e3 is a common idea, where you'll then play queen to d2 and try and get castled queenside. The point being that they do not have this knight move to attack your bishop in this exact line, because the pawn on e6 prevents the bishop from defending the knight. And so queen can just simply capture the knight on g4, and unlike the English attack variation, you don't need to have the pawn pushed to f3. A similar idea I've seen a little bit more fashionable as of the last few years is to play queen f3 in similar positions like this, and there's no knight on g1 that needs to get developed to f3. But that's just mentioning alternatives here. The main line, if you're the top GM in today's world, is to play pawn g4. And this is exactly what we get with the correspondence game. This is known as the Keres Attack, named after Paul Keres, who came up with this idea. It is a very wild attacking variation. This is going to be a really fun game. Now, so it's pretty interesting here, because in the annotations for this game, our viewer playing white here said that they had no idea that this kind of variation would get so wild. There's a lot of chances for both sides to go wrong. Black plays pawn h6, of course, to deter white from playing g5 and kicking this knight. If they didn't play that, g5 probably would have been played. And so now white reinforces the threat, rook to g1. And black plays pawn a6, which I'm not too familiar with this. It makes sense in a lot of these Sicilian lines, kind of playing it like a Najdorf variation, where you're controlling the b5 square. I imagine the idea is similar, possibly even supporting pawn b5 long term. But here I think this idea is slightly slow, and rather than play a6, I think they're probably better off either playing the knight to c6, or possibly advancing with e5, but once again that's opening theory, that's not too important, and a6 was played. White plays pawn to h4, and even now, I think white has a slight positional advantage. In fact, the engine says this is almost +1, and things get slightly worse by white's next move. Obviously anticipating g5, got a little bit worried with their knight, and they retreat the knight back to d7. But now white's advantage is a little bit larger, and g5 is going to come regardless. Now our viewer did find the g5 move, but let me show a variation and might be a little better resistance. So returning back here, remember this is the French variation of the Sicilian. d5 is probably supposed to be supported, and here this is no different. I think d5 is a little bit better of a move. And then white would probably capture on d5. Knight captures back, much more active square than the knight retreating back to d7. And then the idea for white is get castled queenside, because they've already pushed these pawns, the rook is in no place to castle, and so the plan will be something like bishop to d2, they can grab this pawn, we don't care, this is a wild position where one pawn on the edge of the board is not going to matter, it's really about going after each side's king, and then queen to e2, this idea coming up to castle queenside. Now keep in mind, black probably has to do something about this knight, probably capture on c3, because if they don't, the threat is actually white capturing here, and then black won't be able to take back because this pawn is already pinned to the king. Now going back in the earlier part of the variation, I mentioned d5 and capturing here. but you may also wonder what happens if e5. And although this is a missed opportunity, I may even change the icon manually to a mistake, because now black will just bring their knight back, but there's no way to open up the position. You see this pawn is just completely blocked, and here we can push g5, but it's not really that great. Compare that to here when we capture on d5 instead and try and open things up. With this variation, we still have g5 long term, but this knight a little bit more loose. We might be able to get our queen in. There's a lot better attacking potential to try and open up the position. Now let's exit those variations, get back to the real game. We do have the pawn trades here, and then black wants to stop their pawn from advancing. They play pawn g6, which is the best move according to the engine. Black should probably fee and shadow their bishop and try and get castled. It might look a little scary because they're missing an h-pawn and their king is not ideally safe there. But castling kingside is much better than the slow plan developing all of these pieces, and then castling to the queenside where you have a missing c-pawn. So I think black has to be a little careful they don't fall too far behind in development. White plays bishop to e3, and now black plays b5, which objectively is the best move according to the engine. But notice that white already has 3 nice pieces developed. Black only has 1 piece off the back rank, and at that, this knight is pretty passive. It's even questionable how developed this piece really is. This knight may want to relocate somewhere like c5 in the future. That d7 knight really belonged on f6, but the g5 pawn has kicked that away. And so I'd say white is slightly winning here. They play a3 to prevent black from pushing here and kicking the knight. And I approve of that idea, because black is behind in development, they created a threat, we addressed it, and black still has the same problems they have to deal with. Queen c7 was played, and now we get to a moment that I think is probably a subtle inaccuracy, which is that in the game they played queen to e2. I think a little bit better was similar to the idea I mentioned earlier. You want your queen on d2 and then castling queenside. That way your queen and rook will be on the d file, and you're also doing a little bit to deter black from playing the d5 idea that we mentioned. These are some of the main ideas, so if you play this in the future, you'll be more familiar with the common patterns. Queen e2 does not line up the queen with the rook that'll come to d1, but it's also blocking in this bishop from developing. Now the bishop more or less has to go to g2, which is actually not a bad square here, but it's better to keep the options open and not have it blocked in by the queen. Black plays knight to e5, which is not a bad move. They are advancing the knight to a good square, but it does get in the way of potentially e5. It doesn't really do much to support d5, and really the piece development was the problem. I think if we go back here, you really have to just fee in shadow and then get castled. Or at the very least develop a new piece, something like bishop to b7. But this is what was played. White now castles. I still like white's position here. Black plays bishop out, trying to get developed. And now I like this next move a lot, which is pawn to f4. The knight finds the c4 square. But this is where we kind of slip a little and the momentum shifts as we kind of let our foot off the gas pedal. The move that was played was rook d3. And there's no annotations for this move, so we'll kind of have to wonder what the purpose was. I assume maybe it was anticipating the knight taking the bishop, and they wanted to take back the rook. But just visually, this rook looks really misplaced. And I think if you want to improve as a chess player, get to those little higher ratings, maybe 1800 plus, this kind of move should just scream kind of an ick to you. Maybe it's not good to be too disgusted over a move visually, but this is pretty close. It's completely uncoordinated. It's better to usually have the rooks connected or on an open file. Here, this rook just looks a little misplaced. And so rook d3 is not even a candidate move of mine. If we go back here, I think the way to keep the pressure up and keep your foot on the gas was to simply play f5. You've already played f4. And I'll show a human-like variation that could come up. If they trade pawns and they take back, now we have the bishop f4 check, discovered a check by the queen. And if they block with the bishop, then we play knight d5. And you can see how our very active pieces are putting a lot of pressure on them. They'll bring their queen back to defend the bishop, but white's advantage here is already over +6 according to the engine. You can play the rook to e1, you can play this to decoy the pawn away and expose their king even more, and black's position is just very passive, especially with these 3 pieces really doing nothing. But of course I don't want anyone to feel bad. The whole point of analysis is to learn and moments where you can improve. I've played moves that are much worse than rook d3, but it's important to learn why these moves are not so great so you can try and avoid playing them in the future. Now I think black probably should continue developing and getting castled, as I've mentioned, but instead they let white off the hook a little bit and they waste time with another pawn move. Yes, they are trying to pawn storm on the castled king, but this move is simply so slow, and in this case it just drops the b5 pawn. Our viewer finds it, they are having trades on b5, and now the annotations here is saying, I am up a pawn and I feel quite happy, but my position feels quite loose. And I really like annotations for a game like this because it gives you a little mindset into what they're thinking. I would rephrase the terminology loose and switch it maybe for undeveloped. If we look at this bishop, it's not doing much. This rook is also out of play for the time being. And even this queen is a little misplaced, kind of blocking in the bishop. So maybe you feel a little uncomfortable because you're not fully developed yet. And also this rook is slightly awkward. But I wouldn't really describe it as loose. I mean, most things are defended. This knight is the only thing undefended for the time being, but it's also not under attack, and we can always drop the knight back to c3 if needed. Now, white's advantage is over +4 according to the engine here, but of course in a real game you won't know what the evaluation is. And so I would say from a psychology standpoint, maybe our player playing white here feels like they're maybe about +1 or +2 in the evaluation, but nowhere near +4. And that's a very technical way of saying they don't fully understand where all of their advantage is coming from. So if I were to say just 2 words that gives where this advantage is coming from, it is development and king. And I guess if you want a third word, we could say king safety, because that king on e8 is very exposed. This king on c1 is relatively safe. And so white's goal here needs to be continue developing pieces and try and rip open the center. That's why a move like f5 really came to mind earlier. But okay, the game continues. Queen c6 is a good move. We relocate this knight attacking the queen. That's fine. We have queen to a4, trying to bring an attacker towards white's king. Rook c3, and now white finally has to deal with the d5 move that black has played. We mentioned this way back in the opening when we identified this as the French variation, but now it's finally on the board, so how do we address this? In this case, it's actually pretty simple. We just capture, they capture back, and then we have the potential discovery, something like bishop to f2 check, or we can continue piece development and play bishop g2, putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal. The move that was played in the game was knight b3, but instead of that, I would like to mention one other alternative, which is going back here, we can also consider the tricky idea queen to f3. Now here's an icon that's not used too often. I'm going to add it myself. This is an icon which describes any move that's interesting, usually some kind of alternative or cool variation that could come up. It's a move that may or may not be objectively best, but it's got some really good ideas to it, and very well might be one of the best moves. See, this move is tricky because we're attacking the d5 pawn, and even though we're not fully developing yet, if black tries to defend that pawn, say queen d7, one of the best engine defenses, now his bishop captures c4, and you'll already notice this pawn cannot take because then you're looking at the rook on a8, which further highlights the fact that black was severely underdeveloped. But of course I know everything looks easier in hindsight. I'm sure everyone has a similar feeling when they analyze the game themselves, or especially so when a higher rated player analyzes the game for them. But that's the point of this coaching playlist here, where I hope everyone can learn from these videos and get some free tailored advice a little bit more specific than just don't hang pieces, or other cliche phrases like that. Now let's go back to the real game. Knight b3 was the one that was played. Bishop e7, preventing any kind of discovered checks by a bishop move from e3. And so we have bishop d4, attacking this rook. I like that move a lot. And so the move that was played was rook to h4. Now knight c5 happens, which moves their knight a little bit forward, also attacks the queen. Queen c6 was the move. And now this move, even I didn't see at a first glance. So props to white for finding this here. The exchange sacrifice, rook captures c4. Engine loves this exchange sacrifice. And the annotations say, I decided to play the exchange sacrifice, which looks really strong because of the skewer. And of course the skewer they're referring to is this. And now this queen and rook are under attack. But notice they're not just winning the exchange back, this queen can't defend the rook here, because then the knight would just capture the queen. So this is just a tactic where simply white is winning material. Now, they played queen d6 in the game, which is a really cool counterattack. And now the annotations here got a little bit lengthy, but the short version of it is they realize this bishop is under attack, and now capturing on a8 immediately looks a little too risky, but they weren't exactly sure if they should capture it or not. So they were really considering capturing a8. Well, of course it's a hanging piece. That would definitely be a line I would have to calculate, but you notice that the bishop was attacked. So I think one line you definitely have to calculate here is, let's see, if we take the rook, and they capture the bishop, is this safe for us? And white was unsure when they were doing this, and they decided not to go for it. But here, you don't have to look too much further. You really just had to calculate this a little bit, and realize that not only is your knight under attack, but so is the rook. And that alone should make you realize that taking on a8 was not safe. So what should white play instead? I simply like rook to e1, putting pressure on this bishop. And so now black doesn't have time to capture here, because that would hang mate in 1 on e7. And if they try and save their rook while also defending the e7 square, then it's just a matter of slowly maneuvering your pieces and trying to get to the black king. A cool tactic the engine finds to divert the queen is knight b7, which is also an interference to the rook on a7, and in addition to attacking the queen, you're also attacking the rook. But let's say you don't find that engine-esque move, even just retreating the bishop back, and then something like this and relocating your knight. My hope is to get this knight to f6, but we'll get a little more into that later. In the game, it was played rook d1, probably putting more pressure on the black queen. Queen captures f4 check, and the annotations here, white admits that they really don't like their position too much. And I can understand why. From a psychology standpoint, lost a lot of their advantage, and certainly their momentum. And so with the initiative gone, and being down 2 points of material, it can feel like you're losing. But the truth of the matter is, white is still much better than black here. A key idea that was missed a few times here was after this check, they blocked with the bishop. And the thing that they missed is simply this queen check is actually not that great because it helps white play a move they want to play, which is king b1. Now their king is a little bit safer, and very often when you castle queenside, king to b1, or in the case of black, it'd be king b8, are usually moves you want to play. In the case of white, it just makes dangerous checks from this diagonal a little bit less dangerous, because now your king is over here and it's no longer a check. But this was missed a few times because we blocked with the bishop. We have queen back to h2. Attacking the queen, and then they come back with a check again. And once again, we come back with the bishop. Which here, I think, highlights the fact that white didn't realize their king is slightly safer on b1, and black is actually helping them do so. Generally speaking, you don't want to be helping your opponent. And in this case, in a very slight way, black is actually helping white because they're wasting a move, the queen check, and provoking white into playing a move that they wanted to play anyway. If there was no queen check, white might voluntarily waste a tempo playing king b1 in the future. But alright, I think the point has been made clear enough. They come back to e5 here. And now the threat by black is bishop captures c5. The bishop can't capture back because white would lose the queen. And so to address that, I think just get out of the pin. I'd play queen to f2, which is also attacking the rook, but also adding a little extra defense to this knight. Instead, queen d2 is played, which is still not bad, but it doesn't carry a threat to this rook. And this knight is still slightly weak. Now, the thing that saves it here is we are still attacking this rook, so black cannot forget about that. But black did not. They played rook to a7, also defending this bishop a little bit more. As we looked at in some variations, that square might have been potentially weak. But now white has shifted their forces from the e-file and kind of slid them over to the d-file. Now white realizes that the e-file might be good, and so rook e1, it kind of almost corrects a mistake, and maybe things do belong on the e-file. Black brings their queen back, and now in the game was played bishop to f2. Probably intending this and then adding more pressure is my guess. But remember I mentioned a knight to f6, and I said I would come back to that a little bit later. If instead of bishop to f2, relocate to e4, let's say they try and develop, we'll go to f6, and if they capture, we'll take back. Black probably wants to step out of the pin, and they can't move left because of our queen. So king f8 looks like a forcing line to calculate. Now don't forget, we can still win material back, but even better is to take the knight here. They recapture. And then we're actually threatening this checkmate here. They have to block back. It's a forced mate here. That being a check, they move over, and then this will actually lead to checkmate. Instead of king g8, you may wonder what happens if they just take the bishop. And that's checkmate in one move sooner, with either rook or queen captures on e8. That ends the game. It seems like an attack almost came out of nowhere, but when you have pieces that developed and black's king is out in the open in the center, sometimes there's ways to finagle things like that and get a quick checkmate. But okay, bishop f2 check was played. It's still a good move. It still attacks the rook. White still has their advantage. They saved the rook, of course. They're also threatening this idea, and if it wasn't for the bishop interference on e3, or another piece like the rook, then they're actually threatening to win the queen here. One more reason why the king on b1 would have been slightly better. Then you wouldn't have to deal with any of these problems. Now here, although it is not the objective best move according to the engine, I still like knight e4 and trying to relocate to f6. The best engine move being bishop d5, adding a little pressure to the king. But instead, the move was bishop to f1 in the game. And this is really a missed opportunity here. I may even call this move a blunder. The game annotation saying the point is bishop captures c4. But with black's king being pinned, black actually found the best move here, which is king to f8. And now we see some of the problems. White really doesn't have time to be playing this, because now they walk into this problem, and if you try and block, they'll capture anyway. And if white captures, black can capture the knight, and even if you trade, black still won material there, and white has really no attack, and on top of that, your bishop is misplaced. So how do we get out of this? Well, interestingly enough, the top engine move is King B1, just ignoring the knight, which is kind of a funny engine thing. But I think more human is equally good. Knight E4 trying to relocate to F6, but instead, knight to E6 check was played. The annotation said, I think the expression is throwing more wood on the fire. And that sounds like a good term, maybe something you'd read in a Grandmaster book, but sometimes you just have to call a duck a duck. And in this case, I'd call this giving up material. And that may sound a little bit harsh, because this was a planned sacrifice, but let's say they go here, as they did, and capture back. Where's the follow-up? You've given up 2 points of material, black is now up by 5, so it's not even just the knight, and black's king looks relatively safe. Yeah, sure, they've moved a pawn a little bit, so they're slightly more exposed, but can we checkmate black? And I think the answer is no, which means the knight move to e6 was just unsound. Black is going to save their attacked rook, and if white takes it before then, and black captures back, you can throw in a check, sure, but after king g7, black is still up 3 points of material, and their king is much safer. And even stronger, according to the engine, was king to g8, which looks a little bit more exposing, but according to the machine, that's a slight advantage. Now let me continue this variation, king to h7. But after this move, there's really no follow-up. Now I'll give an example of where they could go wrong. King f8 looks like a good way to get out the checks, but then bishop captures c4. They'll try and defend this pawn, but white can take it anyway. And you can see that white is making a little bit of progress. Rook f1 check is threatened, and I would definitely prefer white here. But okay, we've played the sacrifice on e6, and then queen d4 was the follow-up. But I really don't see us getting in yet, and it looks like black's king is hanging on just long enough. In the game, bishop with check was played. Now the king moves to b1, this time pretty much by force. Rook to b7 saves the attacked rook. White captures the e6 pawn. c3 trying to open up white's king. Rook captures g6 was played. Rook captures b2 check. Also strong would have been rook to h1, pinning this bishop. King a1, and then rook h1. And at this point, white resigned, but it was a pretty insightful game, and I think white did pretty well. They just made 1 or 2 mistakes too many. Now, to their defense, they had no idea that the Keres attack would lead to all these complications, but let's go back and review the game real briefly and see some of the main moments once again, where I think could have been improved on slightly. I think the first kind of big moment was queen e2, getting into the way of the bishop from developing, giving it really the only option of g2. When better would have been the thematic queen d2 and then castling queenside. This is a pretty good pattern to keep in mind. I can put the moves on the board really quickly and show this variation of the King's Indian Defense that has this exact same pattern. It goes like this. Knight f3 is the normal variation, but here we'll be playing the Zamish with pawn f3. Black castles will play the bishop to e3, and after a lot of moves by black that do not put pressure on white, such as a6, the next move, you've guessed it, queen d2. Not e2, but d2 with the same exact idea of castling queenside very soon, and keeping this bishop open to develop. In this case, it will probably end up on e2. The other big moment I think here was rook to d3 on move 16 of the game. That wasn't even a candidate move of mine. But through pattern recognition, you kind of need to develop this sense of what moves just visually look bad. And this is a good example of a move that you kind of want to train yourself to avoid, because it's just so uncoordinated from the other rook, and also this rook kind of gets in the way of the bishop that may want to capture this strong knight. Of course, the queen is also in the way, but I would have preferred the queen to be on d2 or f3, based on where black's pieces were. With the knight on c4, we don't want the queen on d2, so probably queen f3, the d rook back on d1, and then at least bishop captures c4 is a playable option. I know this moment was not a mistake, but I just want to point it out once again, and really highlight the fact that white played really well this game. Of course, I'm critiquing this, that's the whole point of analysis, so I don't want you to feel bad. I mean, there are some really cool moves like this, and white is definitely winning here. But of course, my job to help you is to help find better alternatives and basically point out why some of these moves are not the best as they could. And so on move 33 here, once again, I think a slight improvement would have been knight e4. This was missed a few times in the game, but especially here, and try and improve this knight to f6. I think those were the real highlights of the game. I think everything else was just small nuances and details, but even just those main points I think will really help you improve, if you can learn from those mistakes, and at least be less likely to play them in the future. The Keres Attack is a really complicated position, but if you like these kind of dynamics, it could be a fun opening to choose in your repertoire. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I hope you learned something from this chess video. Don't forget to send in your own games through the chess.com forum thread I linked in the video description. And so stay tuned, and I will see you in the next chess video.